should be accessible to everyone. That's really important. Mutual Group and its foundation has a long-standing history of investing in the community where we have a footprint. Every year we're averaging at least 9,000, 10,000 volunteer hours that are reported and recorded, but each one of those community members always says to me,
Home is the training ground for her dreams policy from American Family Insurance. Insure carefully. Dream fearlessly.
Hi, I'm Kim Sponham, CEO and President of Summit Credit Union. We are so excited to sponsor another Madison 365 Women's Leadership Summit. Women's financial health is especially important to us at Summit Credit Union, and we've focused on it for more than a decade. Women are twice as likely as men to associate negative emotions with their finances, and it's no mystery why. Women still earn less than men for a variety of reasons. Women have less saved for retirement, and they're almost half as likely to invest in the stock market when compared to their male counterparts. But we're also seeing positive signs. There are more female entrepreneurs than ever before, and we know from experience that women with higher levels of financial literacy tend to save more, spend more wisely, and invest more than their peers. I encourage you to use this conference as an opportunity to improve your own financial literacy and find inspiration in the incredible women joining us today. Thank you for letting us be a part of your journey.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Madison 365 Women's Leadership Conference, Purposeful Inclusion in the Workplace discussion this afternoon. My name is Gia Gallimore, pronouns she, her, hers, and I currently serve as the Director of Diverse Alumni Engagement for the Wisconsin Foundation and Alumni Association. I'm really excited to be here with you this afternoon and with our lovely panelists. So we'll take a few minutes to get to know them before, of course, we jump into this enriching conversation. First, we'll start off with panelist Kayla Conklin.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this massively important topic. Today, I am currently working as the Talent Management Officer at Park Bank in Madison. I ventured to Madison around 2014 to come to UW for college, where I studied legal studies, psychology, and with an emphasis in nonprofit leadership and administration. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in 2018 from UW-Madison, and I participated in various activities while I was at the university, such as cheerleading. I cheered for the university. I was in the Associated Students of Madison and also part of the Black Student Union. And then shortly after my time at UW-Madison, I engaged with human services, and I worked with various nonprofits in the community, starting with corrections, where I worked in halfway houses and reentry. I transferred to working with youth and families at Briar Patch and Rise, Wisconsin, supporting at-risk youth with crisis stabilization. And ultimately was just looking for more of a career change, recently, which led me to Park Bank, where I now do talent management. And so I handle recruitment, retention, and training and development with a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, which is why this topic is really near and dear to my heart. And so I'm excited to talk about this with the other panelists today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Next, we have Dr. Damira Grady.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Dr. Damira Grady. I am on my third day at Madison College, serving as the Vice President of Equity and Inclusion and Community Relations. I'm coming to Madison College from my previous role at UW Oshkosh, where I served as the Associate Vice Chancellor of Academic Support for Inclusive Excellence, and as the University Diversity Officer. Yes, very long titles. They love long titles in the UW system, as many of you probably know. I, prior to that, worked in many community colleges. I currently live in Milwaukee and worked at Milwaukee Area Technical College. I worked at Gateway Technical College. I was an instructor at Blackhawk Technical College. I'm still an instructor at UW Platteville, where we're sunsetting our Master's in Education and Counseling, but helping get some of our students finished there. And started my journey, actually. I moved from California to Wisconsin. I was someone who aged out of foster care and came to Wisconsin, have been here ever since. So it's where I'm local, it's my place. But started this journey working at UW Milwaukee in a program that served low-income students who had children. It was called Life Impact Program at the time, but now has transitioned to do more student support more holistically. And I'm still tied to that program because as a student who was a parent myself, caregiving needs that have been exacerbated during COVID is something that I've always cared about. Outside of my work in higher education, and as I see myself as an essential worker in DEI, I'm also a licensed professional counselor. So a lot of my work there is tied to helping individuals understand this idea of conscious inclusion, racial battle fatigue, how to combat racial trauma in doing this work. So I'm very excited to have the conversation today with the ladies on the call, and then hopefully just to walk away again with more knowledge for myself. I come into this work as someone who's always saying, I don't know what I don't know. And as things constantly change, I have 3 children, 2 of them at UW-Madison, who inform me every day that they're more woke than I am. So as things constantly change, I'm always intrigued of having conversations with those who are on the front line to further inform my work. So thank you.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. We are all lifelong learners. So thank you for that. Our next panelist, we have Dr. Christina Outlay.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Christina Outlay, and I am very pleased to be here on this panel today. I am currently the executive director of MADAM, and we are a Madison-based nonprofit organization. Our mission is to recruit and work with girls and youth of color and provide knowledge, skills, and experience for careers in STEM. Heavy emphasis within STEM on technology and engineering. And we do that through a combination of outreach activities, school-based and summer immersive programs, and paid high school internships. I just joined MADAM this January as executive director, and I'm actually still transitioning at the same time from my position as an associate professor of information technology at UW-Whitewater. I've been a professor of IT for about 14 years, and before that, working in corporate IT for 11 or 12 years, as well as serving 8 years in the U.S. Navy Reserve as an information systems specialist. Largely living in Chicago or Illinois area. I'm a Chicago native and relocated to Wisconsin almost exactly 10 years ago now, and that was for my position at UW-Whitewater. While at UW-Whitewater, I've also worked with our Cyber Girls summer initiatives, looking to do similar to work to what we do at MADAM, focusing on girls and attracting them to IT, and also served a very brief stint at UW-Whitewater as a diversity coordinator for the College of Business. Outside of directly professional activities, I'm currently the president this year of the Police Commission in Sun Prairie, and my husband and I have 4 children ranging in age from 28 to 2. And yes, you heard that right, 28 to 2. So based on my background and experience, what I really hope to bring to this panel and just to all the activities that I do is a perspective as someone who is a Black woman navigating a number of different environments where I'm often the minority and experiencing some positive, things and some negative, but also as a leader, very actively working to be a purposefully, unapologetically inclusive leader and recognizing, even directly experiencing the balance between theory and knowledge and practical application and, the gaps that exist between those two.
Thank you so much, Dr. Outlay. Last and certainly not least, we have Nasra Wehelie.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And it's very an honor to be part of this esteemed ladies who has these qualifications to be on the panel. Again, my name is Nasra Wehelie, and I have been Madisonian for the last 33 years. Graduate from UW-Madison undergraduate and MBA from Cardinal Stretch University. I have worked in various professional, particularly nonprofit, for the last 15 years. And currently, I am the president and the CEO of Empathy for Equity. Empathy for Equity exists to build a culture of empathy for organizational excellence. Our people approach centered in organizational culture strengthened to make people for the solution. Through our equity and social change process, the 4 Ps, purpose, policy, practice, and progress, Empathy for Equity develops strategy in building empathy for organization and connecting with their employees and the organizations. I have learned in empathy piece when I worked with nonprofits, particularly those who are marginalized. So in order to lead with empathy, one must have a thorough personal understanding of what empathy means to the individual. This really opened my eyes to the need for empathy-based approach in the community to bridge gaps between the different in community I have lived with and worked with. Like Christine said, I have many intersectionality of social identity, being a Muslim, being Black, being immigrant, being, a Black woman. A lot of the time I was the only person in that table. So that really gave me resilience and strength to be a leader in that field. So building a culture of empathy weaves people and communities together in more genuine way. Outside my consulting business, I am a member of the Madison Common Council for District 7, West Side Madison, and also serves on the Boys and Girls Club of Madison, Dane County, and Wisconsin League of Municipalities, which is helping municipal government, township, and other cities, how they can be able to develop strategies, policies to do the work of the cities. In addition to being a consultant and serving on different organizations, I'm a mother of 4. My oldest is 29 years old, and youngest is 18, who's just got into UW-Madison Department of Biomedical Engineering. And I just want to give shout out to Madam Christine. As per the other day I shared, my son has really benefited from Madam. So I'm really excited to be here and just share my thoughts on what, purposeful inclusive means. And I look forward to sharing my information.
Thank you. So as you all can see, we have a wealth of knowledge on this panel, personal and professional experiences. So really excited to get into this. And so we're actually going to start back with you, Nazara. Why do some workplaces still struggle with inclusion? And as we think through that, how can workplaces start to think broadly about how to be purposeful in their work?
So this is my, when I look at this question, the way I look into when I was developing my business, I've seen in olden times, what people focus more is diversity and inclusion. So we heard the nuances of D&I work, and later on, after maybe the last 4 decades, equity piece was added. And, so you see that, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but there's still some disconnect. And, what I have done for the last 5 years in doing more research is what's missing. And what's missing is empathy piece. So organizations have spent billions of dollars in diversity training, yet fail to realize such in return on their investment. Too often people think it's just like one size fits all. And if we have learned over the last 40 years, it takes more than training to have inclusive workforce environment. Diversity, equity, and inclusions are not hypothetical concept that organization can pay lip service to. The workplace is increasingly changing to be diverse, whether it's in generational, gender, and racial, and so many intersectionality. And an employer who don't value this diversity and this changes, it's very important that they will be losing their competitive edge. So with that, what I have developed is being very intentional into how organization needs to develop some policies, procedure, and practice. For example, if we want to be inclusive, it doesn't mean that we hire a person of color for a chief diversity officer, or we hire someone who is different from diverse background into the workforce. The question is, what do we do after that? When we hire someone, or when we hire a chief diversity officer, what is the purpose for that? So I think what organization need to do is doing some alignment in how they can be purposefully have an inclusive, but more of a belonging environment. And that comes with the empathy and more leader who can really showcase the work of the organization. So again, I don't have my 2 minutes up, but it's just like being intentional and having a practice, policy, and process in place. And one area is like, let's say, if we have recruitment and if we have retention, and people are growing. It's not just black and white or people of color or white women and all that, but how we can be intentional in understanding the cultural competency in the organization, the cultural humility, where we can be able to challenge our own viewpoint, but also understanding the differences and making more in self-awareness and self-critiquing how we can become more intentional in creating that diverse but more belonging environment.
Thank you for sharing that. It's that empathy piece and that in personal piece, right? How are we educating ourselves so that we can be more empathetic? We can understand to help inform our policy and changes is really important. Is there anybody else that would like to add to this question? Okay, so we have a lot to tackle, so we're gonna keep moving along. So as we talk a little bit about inclusion in the workplace, we also have to look at how we're building a culturally inclusive workforce from an ultimate health lens, right? So how do we have a healthy organization, right? In kind of connecting to all of the 4 Ps that Nasra was talking about. Kayla, can you talk a little bit about before we recruit, right? So before we go out, we recruit for diverse talent, what steps should a business or organization take?
Absolutely. So I think it's important to survey your current environment and understand where you're at this moment right now. Because if you don't understand where you're at in your journey right now, how can you determine where you want to be? So that would be the first part, would just be, using data, asking your employees to share their experiences, really getting the feedback from your current employees on how the environment is looking currently. And then after that, building the infrastructure to support these diverse candidates that you're looking to bring in, because they do need resources and support immediately when they start at your company. And so I always say that you're setting people up to fail if you are just hiring with the idea that we will just bring diversity by hiring Black people or brown people or somebody with a marginalized identity. Because what they need when they get there is a lot of things. They need policies and procedures to support them. They need safe spaces. They need representation in leadership so they can see a pathway to growth for them. And so I think that if you don't understand all of that infrastructure that's needed internally, then it's hard to provide an opportunity that's really truly an opportunity for that person who has been historically underserved. And then I would just add that in addition to that, I really think that it's important that companies understand that inclusion is an investment. And so it's going to take spending your dollars differently and looking at how you spend your money and what you spend your money on, and be willing to be uncomfortable and okay with how that has to change to work towards what you're trying to get at. If you truly want an inclusive environment, it will speak for itself. Once it gets there, you should not have to tell people this is an inclusive environment. And so that is what I think you need to build that healthy organization, and to really give those new hires that true opportunity of a good experience with a company.
I'd love to chime in on that. Also pick up somewhat on what Nasra mentioned. I think we often think about diversity and building a diverse team. And even as looking around our team and our environment, we look at, who are we missing? How can we diversify the team? But we don't think about first, why would someone want to join this, this culture that we currently have? Do we have a culture that's going to support a diverse team? And also, keep them there, as Kayla just mentioned, because you don't want to recruit someone new and have them leave because we don't have an environment that's comfortable and that's welcoming, or we haven't prepared our existing team members to be cognizant of cultural differences and perspectives and just general life differences, and to be respectful and inclusive as we interact with one another. And, beyond that, we often think a lot about race and gender, both related to diversity and related to inclusion. But there are so many different subtle things to consider, especially as you begin to recruit new team members, such as the imagery that your organization puts forth, externally and internally, the wording that you use in job descriptions, and whether they are gendered language, or even if it's not explicitly gendered language or race-based language, if you're using terminology or requesting skills and levels that typically we know through research may be women interpret a different way, or is not inclusive of different ableness needs and stuff like that. And what a lot of people don't even think about is the huge debate regarding salary and benefits, and what we include and what we do and don't list in our job descriptions. And beyond that, how we recruit, because I serve in different capacities, and now I have to walk a lot of what I've been talking for many years to other people when we go out to recruit, and we're concerned about a pool that doesn't contain as many diverse candidates as we would like. And so the fallback, or the cop-out, I'm going to call it a cop-out, is that there aren't enough diverse candidates available. Or if we're specifically looking to add more Black people to our team, there aren't enough Black people in the pool, or they're not applying for our jobs. And while in some areas like mine in IT, you don't have as many, maybe relatively speaking, who are in the pool, that's not the same as saying there aren't any in the pool, or as just throwing out a job description and saying, oh, well, nobody applied for it, so we did what we could. You do have to be intentional about building up your network, reaching out to organizations that serve diverse communities and may have some people who are interested in a position. If you find someone, I'm thinking in particular about police now and police leadership, and we have some in the area who have women or who have LGBTQ or Black or Brown leadership within their ranks and reaching out to them directly, because if they're on that track, they absolutely have some colleagues and friends who are also on that track, and you have to put forth that extra work. I've encountered in roles where I didn't have a direct influence, pushback such as, well, if they want the job, they should apply for it, right? Or we shouldn't have to do that much work. And I would say, well, maybe we shouldn't have to, but if we're intentional about hiring a diverse group, then we're going to have to do it. You have to do it. And so that is something that as a leader now, as executive director, I can directly influence and do, but find that in other roles, on committees and things like that, it's more difficult to get leadership to change in that way and actually do the work that's necessary. Be more active, I think, instead of passive.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else that would like to add to this conversation?
I feel like we could spend the rest of the time just unpacking this question. Many things that are coming up for me. Oftentimes when I am asked to come in and consult for either a nonprofit, a corporation, higher education space, I ask people, what is your why? And as someone who's been in this discipline for over 15 years, it's joyful for me to see everybody showing up in this space and wanting things to be different. But then it's also scary for me because I see a lot of violent things happening, this voyeurism happening around this work, and people not really understanding their why and quantifying what diversity, equity, inclusion, or empathy, belonging means to their organization. Is it to check a box? And if we are going to use data to inform us, what does our environmental scan look like? If we don't even have the sample size, or we are going to treat groups as though they're monolithic, like one Black person can speak for all Black people, etc., we're not going to get rich samples or information unless we're intentional, not just intentional about revamping our policies and practices in our organizations, but intentional about our sampling and how we're getting that information, how we're getting our data, and understanding that there are individuals that want to come to our organizations and just be Black. They don't want to inform you. They don't want to educate you. They don't want to participate in affinity groups or employee resource groups. They just want to come and work. They don't want to be segregated. And oftentimes we're selling them their oppression. They're coming to these spaces, not having to show up as a racialized individual until they come to our organizations. And then we're wrapping all of these, what we call supports around them, but we're traumatizing them. And so I see a lot of greatness and all of the practices that have been in place since kind of the after George Floyd's murder and all the other flashpoints that have happened. But I also see a lot of scary things happening that have concerned me in this work, and as someone who treats this as a discipline and not as someone who's just showing up to be tokenized or showing up with some of the new language and saying, oh, I want a seat at the table. I want to be served a meal at the table. So don't come recruit me unless at your table, I'm not just watching everybody else eat. You're serving me a meal and you're serving it in a culturally competent way. I'm eating something I want to eat.
Thank you. All of that was powerful to unpack. When we're talking about culture, we're talking about safe spaces, when we're talking about our psychological being, and how these companies and organizations are not necessarily always taking that into account. So thank you for sharing all of that and the importance of surveying and things of that nature. I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about outreach, right? Dr. Christina, how important is it for our businesses to outreach and look at school to work pipelines to broaden their networks of recruiting?
By school to work, I'm assuming we are not just thinking about higher education to work, but also high school to work and so on, and employers reaching out. Part of our work here in Maidum, in fact, is to get employers to consider that exact thing, which is, especially here in Madison, looking locally at the talent that exists within our community already and working directly with schools and community organizations in order to reach out and develop and support that talent so that we can improve the local economy that we have here, develop our own our own talent, and then potentially to minimize some of the transient nature of our town as it is, where we have particularly tech and science organizations that are recruiting from outside of our area. And those are people who come here and maybe don't like Wisconsin weather or whatever and leave again. And then again, our own communities are left unsupported and unequally developed. We know that the current generation is not going to college at the same rate as previous generations. We have a young generation that is not interested in going into debt and spending another 4 years in college before they're able to embark on a career. We know this. I, in particular, am working with organizations that are in a field that has way more jobs than available applicants. We're interested applicants in those jobs, as well as a diversity problem. And so there are a number of different ways we can address all of those issues by changing how companies recruit, by not necessarily requiring degrees, even advanced degrees for positions where really it's the skill and the knowledge and the experience, and even to some extent the potential, where we can train and develop someone that's important, as opposed to the degree. Requiring a degree in and of itself, and even certain types of certifications, is exclusive in its very nature if you have either someone who doesn't have as much access to it or who doesn't want to pursue that particular track. So looking at current hiring practices and the way that we define necessary experience is one way to change. Working with high schools and providing work opportunities or apprenticeship opportunities for youth and young adults is another way that we can diversify the workforce. Actively working, even before you start hiring, to going back to Kayla, back to Nasra, and back to Dr. Damira, is do the work to prepare an inclusive environment and continue that work, because it's not just one thing that you do once and then stop, but continue that work to make sure that the environment is evolving and inclusive as your talent workforce evolves. Organizations absolutely have to start looking at how they're going to work with middle and high school and community organizations to develop alternate pathways.
Can I add something to that? So I'm been trying to conceptualize how do we move away from this idea of pipeline, because pipeline for some of our indigenous folks is violent, is to this opportunity exposure, right? And I give this example as a licensed counselor in our state, is that we don't have a lot of Black and Brown counselors, but during COVID, the need was great. And what I saw was people would reach out to me, we can't get a Black or Brown counselor, they're just not in the pipeline. But the reality is that the opportunity gap we weren't addressing. So in our state, to become a licensed counselor, you have to go through school, get a master's degree. They increase the amount of credits you have to get. Then you have to do 3,000 hours of supervision. Typically, you have to pay someone to supervise you, and then you have to sit for a test. So what higher education institutions and some nonprofits we're asking people to have 2 years of experience before they could even apply. But how about we remove those barriers and account for the opportunity gap that exists and sponsor someone? The opportunity exposure then becomes an opportunity sponsorship. And we don't think about that. So we want diversity, but we aren't ready to interrogate the very practices that we have in place, that even if we got someone into our organization, they are now staffled. They're not going to be able to professionally develop because we haven't accounted for the opportunity gap that exists and just the nature of higher education being a structurally excluded place for Black and Brown folks, especially Black and Brown women.
Yes, and I can add on to that as well. Being a previous case manager for youth and families that were at risk, at times, a lot of these, youth that are struggling aren't going to a traditional school. And so with that, I agree with you, Dr. Damira, like that word, school to work pipeline is not even attainable for some youth and families. That's not even in their language. And so how do we reach those youth and families? How do we help them? Because those are going to be the groups that are made up of historically underserved groups and underserved people. And so we want to make sure that we don't let people fall through the cracks. I mentioned earlier that I previously worked with Department of Corrections. How do we, support these individuals who have been incarcerated to get back up on their feet? There's a lot of barriers for them to be able to access jobs, provide even a realistic living wage at this point. And so what can we do to address these things? And so I think that school to work and career fairs and all of that is great, but I often think about the people that are falling through the cracks. Who are we missing, right? There's a lot of people that aren't going to be in those settings. And I think that it's important that we set up spaces and ways to attract those individuals, or maybe we outreach them. And they're going to need more resources and more support and more advocacy when working with these companies for an opportunity. And so that is what
we gotta go get them. They're not going to come to us. We got to meet them where they are. We got to go get them.
Yep.
We have to go get them. We have to think about who we send after them as well. And, it's such a delicate balance between imposing a minority tax, right, on somebody who wants to come to work and just work. They don't want to be the one to always go represent the company, and then sending the wrong person who, the community we're trying to reach or the particular subgroup we're trying to reach is not going to be receptive to, right? How do you balance that out? And then even as we go to reach communities, how do we make sure we are prepared to interact with them? I can tell you, having worked in alternative schools, not worked in a school, but went to hold a program in a school, being woefully unequipped to recognize maybe a trauma response occurring during the program where one of the students is acting out, and wanting to be stern and firm, and that's not the right way to react to them, or just in general being aware of how early gender identity and other types of issues factor in when you're working with kids, in fact. And so if you're not prepared to do that, we can identify all of these groups, but we have to make sure that we send the right people in, that we provide the right training, that we approach individuals in the right way, and for ourselves, that we extend grace, because we're going to mess up. No matter how much we prepare, we're going to go in there and we're going to mess up. And then how do we recover from that and continue on, right? So maybe if I'm not taking over, Gia, I would throw out there practically, when we talk about finding the alternative spaces and making sure that we reach the ones who slip through the cracks, how do we make sure that we identify those spaces and we prepare ourselves accordingly?
Yeah,
I'm snapping for you. Yeah.
I want to go ahead and give Nazra some space and time, but we are really having some really good conversation and dialogue, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to really break down and unpack language and what does that mean.
No, thank you, Gia. I'll be short. So I think, all have been said well, and one thing I want to add is, and one of the panels said, is how we can meet the youth where they are at. I think that's the main thing. We have so many great organizations, Boys and Girls Club, you made them after school program, but at the end of the day is how can we mentor and empower those youth so that they can be able to be successful, whether they are getting employment or whether they can go through their education. So I think the main thing is how we can just hone those kids and empower them and mentor them so that, whatever challenge they have, then we can be able to be champion for them.
Thank you so much. Yes, meeting folks where they are, whether they're a student, whether they are an adult, wherever they are in their life, we all need someone that's going to meet us where we're at. And having those important conversations so that we can understand what is needed and not making assumptions at the end of the day. And a lot of that goes back to, like you did mention, Dr. Damira, the importance of language. In reality is language changes all the time, the English language. And so it's really a matter of understanding what your actions are and getting to know what the individual needs, But really, really, really great conversation and discussion. Want to talk a little bit about a point that came up in regards to just groups and creating space. Kayla, in your role as talent management, and anyone else, of course, please jump in. But why is it important for organizations to grow diverse networks to source for potential candidates? But then the second piece of how can affinity groups play a role in that outreach and network if a company has that, right, or seeks to create space for that? How can those groups assist with that outreach?
Yeah, I think that's a really awesome question, and I think that it's just that that safe space is really meaningful, and it goes a long way. And I think that having those groups should be optional, because I think, like Dr. Damira said, like not everybody is trying to show up and be their identity, and just that is that, and that's okay. And so one thing that I like to always say is, like, we invite you to be a part of this group. However, you do not have to join this group if you do not want to. And the other piece is, like, some people don't even feel comfortable with their identity being shared at work, and that's okay too. And that probably means that you might not have an inclusive workplace also. But it also might mean that you do, and they just personally don't want to do that. But I think that connecting with other organizations just creates more opportunity, more experiences to learn from each other, and the opportunity to provide those safe spaces and resources to those individuals in your organization.
I think what I would add to that is just some of the pitfalls, as someone, again, who comes in oftentimes as like an ombudsman or counselor, is to be mindful of the pitfalls. When affinity groups are formed that don't happen organically, it is work. And if you're not culturally competent about the nuance amongst and between different affinity groups, there's infighting, and oftentimes this positionality to be tokenized or have positionality to whiteness that starts happening, where people who don't have agency to really change the policy, practice, and procedures, when they can't fight against the system and they're in group, they fight against each other. So if you're not going to also give them resources to professionally develop, to be in community with each other, to be able to thrive in that environment, you're setting them up for failure. You're going to see retention dwindle, because there's this emotional fatigue that happens when you're always in communication around your identity, but it's not being cultivated in a way that's going to propel you to your next thing, or propel you personally to be able to navigate that in your career, inside and outside of your organization. So I just always challenge people to be mindful of that. It's great. You need to have community. But I also ask people, well, why do you need that community? Why do you have to segregate people in your organization? And what's happening around those affinity groups in terms of resource sharing? And sometimes what happens, and I will tell you, I've seen it become a distraction for Black and brown folks. Okay, you can go over there and do your things while we continue to build policy, practices, and procedures that oppress you. So you're distracted over here infighting while you're still being oppressed. So be mindful of those pitfalls and set people up for success to thrive within an organization. And I think Dr. Christina said, and not be utilized to then have that emotional tax. Now you're going to be the face on our website. So when people come to our career page, you're here, you're in our videos, you're in our marketing, but we're not going to promote you. You're going to be passed over time and time again. And we're not going to work with you to fill in that opportunity gap that we know you have, but we're not addressing. We're going to say, well, you don't have the experience of supervision. You don't have this, but we're not going to work with you to make sure that we're understanding systematic racism and filling in those gaps for you. So I just tell people to be mindful of those pitfalls. And some people, it's generational. They don't want to be segregated. They're ready to be integrated into an organization. And so if everybody is not being centered in a way that we're addressing and centering the most vulnerable, again, the pitfall is that it's going to become a thing that's going to be emotionally exhausting.
I want to add a little bit to that, if I may. And I think, one quote I want to share is, one of the most difficult things is to change society, not to change self. So I think, it's by Nelson Mandela, it's not to change society, but to change self. So I think, with changing the culture, we always see two things: organization, the team, the leaders all of them are different, but I think if we can become very intentional, and Dr. Damira, you talked about the why, is purposefully thinking about what's our why as an organization, defining the purpose, defining the intention, defining the long-term goals, and assessing organizational culture so that you can build a culture that can fit everyone rather than this group and this group and this group. Because I think sometimes it's very exhausting to be part of one group, but then also not knowing what the intention. The other thing is adding, like some kind of practice in place, building practice to sustain behavior change, how we can develop some kind of policies, but practice that can really make meaningful change. And I think that comes along with the culture of empathy, that people are really intentional in transforming their own selves, but also transforming their own organization and culture so people can come in. Sometimes people think like, we want to hire people from diverse background. You need to clean in-house. So people, when they come in, they feel welcome, they feel belonging, they feel that this is them and they can see themselves contributing to this organization. So being intentional and, just seeing what are the practices that can sustain the change, and that can become with the alignment with the individuals that can hone that change.
Thank you. Thank you all for contributing. We do have a question from the audience, and I want to make sure that we tackle that. So staying in line with affinity groups, so anybody, please feel free to jump in. The question is, what are the best practices to create affinity groups? And the second part of that is, should they be programmed or developed organically?
I saw that question come in. I wanted to say that I have never worked for a company that I came in and they already had affinity groups. So I can't really speak to that piece. However, because I think of the timing of the world and George Floyd's murder and everything that happened after that, it fell on the shoulders of the marginalized groups to create the infrastructure to support themselves, which seems backwards. And so while I've worked organically to form affinity groups in multiple different companies that I've worked for, I think that is very harmful and taxing on the people that have to do that work. And so ideally, I think that companies should have it already together, and they should have a budget dedicated to that affinity group to be able to actually provide the resources and the stuff that Dr. Damira was speaking about to be an actual support rather than something that's just causing harm or causing conflict within the community. So while I think that because of timing, a lot of these groups have naturally and organically formed, ideally, in a perfect world, I think it would have been better should that they were set up ahead of time with a dedicated budget with structure.
I'd like to add to that, where we provide budgets for affinity groups and related initiatives. Also make sure that those aren't the first budgets that get cut as soon as a company enters some type of financial turmoil. That's often what I see, which leads some question to how important or critical really was this for the organization in the first place? Was it just basically like some lip service, to show that as a company, we're diverse and inclusive? I've worked for a couple that had affinity groups, and I think that they were all in place at the time that I started, or the company started them. But the challenge there is, what should those groups be, and what do we consider? There's often race, there's often gender. I will now see maybe biracial groups, and often it's one group for all biracial people, even though what makes up their biracialness or multiracialness is different. And so those learned experiences are different, or LGBTQ and so on. And, it's just always, how exactly are you going to set up those groups? I think maybe a delicate balance, or a balance between them, would be to have some that you set up, but also have a mechanism for groups to request an additional affinity group for themselves as they form organically, because groups are going to form organically no matter what. There's a book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And there's research that we know that tells us that once you have a group of 4 or more, typically 4 or more girls, 4 or more non-binary, 4 or more Black, whatever, they're going to cluster together, given that they have some kind of common experiences. So it's going to happen. And often you see despair that these groups are sitting together, or you see despair that groups want to form their own clique together, or have meetings, or have safe spaces. It is natural. And it's important to recognize the need for such. And as Damira, I think you mentioned, then the fighting happens between the groups and which group is more important. And we have the your blues ain't worse than mine type of thing that's happening. And it's just yet another challenge that we have to overcome. As leaders, being mindful of what's the right time to create an affinity group is something to always think about, or how big the organization should be before that affinity group forms, is something to think about, but also just organically how those things happen. And sometimes it's not even based on the more obvious characteristics. It's more so people who are parents. And the fact that support for parents is not limited to mothers, or if we extend beyond affinity groups to the types of benefits that are important to different groups. If we think about maternity leave, offering maternity leave excludes fathers, or making short-term disability something that you can use for maternity leave. Well, only a portion of the workforce actually would have maternity, right? Give birth. And so maybe that should be something else. And we look to the groups to figure out which of these groups do they impact. Is there an intersectional group that we form in addition to that? And how many damn groups do we form anyway? Like, is it going to be 30 groups for an organization of 5,000, or just what is reasonable?
I amplify that just real quick, Tina. All I would say is you don't need to do it programming wise or organically. Just ask yourself this. Do marginalized, racialized, underserved, structurally excluded individuals have a place to gather and be in community? If you can't say yes, how can you help create it? That's it. You don't need to be performative. You don't need any diversity statements. You don't need any land acknowledgments. Do they have space to be in community? Ask yourself that. And if not, fix that.
Dr. Damira, can you say that one more time so I can write that down? I don't want to wait for the video.
Marginalized, racialized, minoritized, structurally excluded individuals have space to gather and be in community. Is it intentional? Right? Do you help them be in community to break bread? If not, fix that.
Thank you.
This conversation really is great because it sums up a quote from Frank Hale Jr. He's the Vice Provost Emeritus at the Ohio State University. Once stated, "Commitment without currency is counterfeit, and don't let anyone tell you different," right? And so that piece about resources and making sure that they are putting resources behind the commitment and not just doing things for sake of, right? So we have one more question from the audience that I want to make sure that we tackle with the 8 minutes we have left. So the question is, what do you suggest people do when they feel the buy-in for DEI hasn't really happened within the organization? I'll repeat that one more time. What do you suggest people do when they feel the buy-in for DEI hasn't really happened within the organization?
Can I say buy-in's a trigger word for me? And this is why. We're always waiting for people to agree for our right to exist as racialized individuals in spaces for us to make change. And I say this, when you're feeling that there isn't buy-in, this sounds sometimes problematic when I say it. I think I'm funny, so just go with it. Some people need to be left behind. It's okay to leave people behind. And a way to do that is to move it off of the personal. What I see in this work a lot of times is, you know what we need? We need programming. We need to make sure our calendar of Heritage Month is up to date and we have things happening. We need to do trainings and make them mandatory instead of inescapable in our practices. Move it off of the personal and have some accountability from the institutional structural standpoint. Interrogate your policies and procedures. Even sometimes I co-op spaces by changing my language. Don't come at it from a DEI belonging standpoint. Come at it from data and return on investment. So move the needle off this personal, we need to get everybody on board to agree. No, move it towards return on investment, outcomes based. Move it away from personal. Move it away from all the fun, performative things and make it institutional, make it inescapable to do this work. Interrogate things through the lens of equity. Make sure you're stress testing them through the lens of equity. And leave people behind, or train them to refresh their Google browser. Confirmation bias is a real thing. So get people to refresh their browser, clear their cookies, and see what's really going on in our world.
Would anyone else like to add to what do we suggest people do?
If I can add, yeah. I think, for me, I'm coming from lens of empathy. I know we have worked a lot with diversity, equity, and inclusion and all that. And we have seen the challenges or the failure of that. However, when we think about empathy, it's how we are transforming workplace culture, how we can create that space. We talk about the Affinity group. We talked about how we can work together. And, it's exhausting to put the DEI work on either on HR or other people of color to lead this effort. It has to come from the top. And the top has to be having the buy-in in transforming the organizations. And, one way of that is just be intentional and building that policy, procedure, and practice in place. I talked about the empathy piece of the four-piece model, the purpose, why is it important to build this culture of empathy within the organization? What's the policy? Designing strategic alignment approach so that everybody has the buy-in into it. And the practice is building a practice to sustain behavior change. And finally, developing measurable goals and monitor success. With that, when we talk about the empathetic environment in the culture, a new study has shown, and it was from Catalyst from 889 employees found empathy has some significant constructive effect. So, Dr. Myra said, if organizations don't want to take the effort, let them be left behind. But then with empathy, there's innovation. When people have reported that, there's an empathetic environment in the workplace, there are 61% of the employee compared to 13% felt that they have created innovation within the organization. The other piece of that is engagement. 76% of people who experience empathy within their workforce reported that they were more engaged compared to 32%. Also retention, 57% of white women and 62% of women of color say they were unlikely to think to leave their companies when they felt their life circumstances were respected and valued by their companies. So again, there has been a research that changing the narratives, changing the just the D&I work itself, it's very very strategic to move forward with economic success for organizations. So it's not just because we need to have the buy-in, but it's something that we really need as an organization to make the impact for the work of the organization.
A strategy that would help with that is looking at your strategic plan. Are your strategic plan and your DEI plan two separate things? Your strategic plan should be your DEI plan, and it should not be an added bullet of your goals or strategy. It should be the thing. There should be synergy amongst your strategies and your DEI. It should be one of the same. And that's one thing that I would recommend for those who are feeling that they're not getting buy-in. You need to collapse those initiatives and then strategies into one thing.
Before we go, I just want to kind of add on a little bit as we talk about these organizational level initiatives and the buy-in from the top is what you can do as a leader in the corporate environment and outside of the corporate environment, in fact, by developing an inclusive lens, being a purposeful leader, and in doing so, you're considerate of other perspectives and needs beyond your own. And then you set that culture of being empathetic toward those other needs and perspectives, even if you don't necessarily agree with them. So I want to give you two examples of being an authentic leader and an example of someone who walks that talk every day. First is a quote. I have no source for this quote. It was a meme I found and made it my motto years ago. And that quote is, be so completely yourself that everyone else feels safe to be themselves too. We often can say this is an inclusive environment. You are free to express yourself culturally, but then in the things that we do and the way that we dress and the way that we present, we're not demonstrating that by example. And the more we do so, the more that our team and our employees and other people that interact with us can feel comfortable doing so as well. Another thing I'm going to say is being an empathetic leader considers perspectives beyond your own where you might or might not agree, rather than philosophizing about whether you should make the change or not. If you know someone has a need, you grant them that need, assuming it's reasonable. And the example I'm going to use here for both of those things is Lizzo. All right, Lizzo. I love Lizzo, love her or hate her. Lizzo is 100% herself in everything that she does. She does not compromise and has empowered an entire community across the world to do so as well. And recently, Lizzo had a situation where she had a word in her song. It was offensive particularly to a subgroup directly impacted, but also by some who heard it. There was a lot of debate regarding whether she should change that word or not because of African American vernacular English, intention, et cetera, et cetera. Beyond all that, Lizzo responded to that need by changing the word and re-recording the whole song and putting out a statement about it, expressing empathy for the need that exists and making the change done. And while there are some who didn't agree, I guarantee you there were many, including myself, who were motivated by that and inspired to put others' needs first and to be that type of unapologetic leader.
Thank you all. We are at time. Please, audience, I hope what you're taking away, right? Intentionality, right? In order to create sustained change. So making sure that we are asking the right questions, making sure that we're checking ourselves, we're educating ourselves. We are forever lifelong learners. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
This is 365 Media.